Thank you, Ashley. Again, I'm Scott Graffius, and this is Level Up the Happiness of InfoSecurity Teams.
It's great
I
to
did
have
want to mention up front for content accessibility purposes, I'm deliberately using relatively large size fonts wherever possible. And I'll be describing also the on-screen content. There are a few slides where it'll be close to word for word, but for most slides, that's not the case. Want happier and more productive InfoSecurity teams? And who doesn't? Among other things, it takes great leadership, and proven strategies can give a real advantage. So that's where the phases of team development comes in. It's a framework that has stood the test of time, more on that in a moment, because it remains highly relevant and beneficial. So if you're a cybersecurity leader or you aspire to be one, you're a member of a team, or you might be in one in the future, and that covers just about everybody else, or you're just looking to develop your related skills. This talk, which is based on Dr. Bruce Wayne Tuckman's model, but with a fresh angle. Among other things, 0% theory, 100% practical information that you can use to help lead and fulfill successful team objectives. Speaking of objectives, after this brief session, you should understand, if you aren't familiar with it already, the 5 phases of team development, the characteristics of each phase, and then most importantly, the usable, proven strategies you can use to apply to teams. So here's the agenda. This is how the talk is structured. First is the introduction, objectives, and agenda, and we're almost done with that. Some information about me as it relates to this talk. And then the main portion of this time together is the 5 phases of team development, followed by a brief wrap-up, a optional digital download takeaway, Q&A, and feedback. And speaking of Q&A and feedback, I do care about your comments and your questions tremendously, but I won't be watching them during the talk. I'll be focused on delivering the content to you. At the end of the talk, there's a section for Q&A and feedback, and we'll utilize whatever time we have to address any comments or questions you have. I look forward to them. And if we're short on time, there's still a way we can follow up with Q&A and feedback, which will be explained at the end. So here's some information about me. I'm a Agile project management practitioner, consultant, author, and speaker. And as of last week, now in 23 countries, I've spoken either in person or virtually. Last week was Nepal. And I'm the CEO, founder, and principal consultant of Exceptional Agility and Exceptional PPM and PMO Solutions. And the last thing I want to mention about the company, quite proud of the fact that 20% of the work that we do is pro bono, or no charge, for charities and nonprofits. Okay, and I'm a member of the IEEE and other professional associations, have a range of credentials and a variety of different industries I've worked in, everything from government, entertainment, consumer products, and more. And I'm honored that content from my books, talks, workshops, and more have been featured and used by a variety of different organizations. And here are just a few, and of these, I'm going to highlight a handful. There is the University of Waterloo, Microsoft, Oracle, Computer Weekly, RSA, Gartner, National Academy of Sciences, and others. So that's enough about me and my background. Here we are onto the 5 phases of team development. So Dr. Bruce Wayne Tuckman, who received his doctorate in psychology from Princeton, did extensive research on what was originally called group dynamics, but shortly thereafter was also known as team dynamics, group development, team development. So in the context of this discussion, those terms, while they're nuanced, they're used interchangeably. So I did want to mention that. And he published his model way back in '65. You might ask, why the heck are we talking about something from '65? Well, if that's your question, I don't blame you. And here's the answer. It's because the model's still relevant and beneficial today. Some examples in a moment. But this talk does draw on my firsthand real-world use of the model. So it's not some sort of theoretical construct that I'm speaking of. Speaking about practical use here, right? And my talk is supported by research and recommendations from a variety of sources. Over 100 went into building this presentation for you. And of them, I drew the line and said 65. So 65 is the bibliography that I'm sharing with you if you're interested, along with additional content at the end of this talk. This is a subset of the 65 items in the bibliography. And of these, I'll just mention a handful. Google, Forbes, IBM, MIT, Microsoft, and many others went into this talk. Oh, and I wanted to also say that many publications will often talk about the benefits, virtue, and value of Dr. Tuckman's model. And that's great because that's reinforcement. But I am delivering something different in this talk. I dug deep into the literature, which I know inside and out, ever since Dr. Tuckman's model was published in '65 and all the literature since. And I took that as my responsibility to be extremely familiar with the content and extract from it, not just that it's a great model, but exactly how you can use it in the real world. That's one aspect, again, which makes this talk, I believe, unique. So to underscore the continuing relevance and value of the model, many of those examples I showed you here on this slide were published in the last 10 years. I say that because the model came out in '65, so I think that's important to make that distinction. Furthermore, many of them were published in the last year, so I did want to mention that. And when it comes to models, usually putting them into some sort of a visual context that you can navigate is often helpful. So that's what I've done here. And at least for me, for this talk, clip art just does not work. So no clip art, not doing that. And there's no stock photos, and there's absolutely no generic content. The only thing I borrowed from is the logo for the conference, which is in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Other than that, it's all custom content. And so here are the phases of team development, which is a custom visual to give you the overview. So as mentioned at the top of the presentation, I'm striving to use large font for content accessibility wherever possible. Obviously, that's not the case here because it will be very difficult or maybe even impossible to make out the text. However, in a moment, we'll be zooming in on the respective content. So the purpose of showing you this visual on this slide here is to give you the overview. So I'll jump right into that right now. At the top, you see a level of performance or productivity across sort of the life cycle of a project team. And speaking of which, Dr. Tuckman's model is agnostic in that it applies to traditional, agile, all flavors of agile, Scrum and Kanban and hybrid models and all sorts of things. So whether we're talking about a team, we're talking about maybe InfoSecurity department, sort of as a team, or we're talking about InfoSecurity project comprised of InfoSecurity team members, or we're talking about a project where it's sort of cross-functional in that there's members from marketing and legal and also InfoSecurity. All those scenarios apply to this model. So I did want to mention that. And below the graph that you see, and by the way, happiness is correlated with productivity and performance. That may not be a surprise to you, but the literature is very clear on that. So I wanted to touch on that briefly here, maybe more later on, time permitting. And then you see the 5 phases going from left to right of team development: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And below those markers, the first row are the characteristics. These are the things that are typically seen or exhibited from the team in their respective phase. So if you're not familiar with the model at all, or you're uncertain, you can almost use it as the diagnostic criteria to identify where is the team. And once you know that, the row below that are the strategies. These are the proven strategies that you can apply to help the team advance its performance, productivity, happiness, and that really means move on to the next phase. And the direction is typically from left to right. More on that at the end if we have time, but that's the direction. And custom visuals representing the team also accompany each phase. So this is sort of a model, the Dr. Tuckman's model, my customized version of his model, but this is about people, right? So for inspiration, I looked for something that I could appropriately use from 1965 when the model first came out. And I didn't find anything that resonated with me that made sense for this talk that could also be custom, or 66, 67, 68. But in 1969, these characters were introduced. Now, this is the Lego version of these characters. So this is sort of the modern incarnation of these characters, but they were introduced in 1969. And these are rather expensive collectibles, I found out. But anyways, this is my photograph of these characters, and they'll be accompanying the visual that you saw earlier slides as we go through the 5 phases of team development. And we're off. Here we go. First up is forming. So this is when I'll give a few different examples because I'm sure that the attendees for this talk come from all kinds of environments. Every company has their own take on doing things. So I'll give different examples, time permitting, as many as possible. Let's say that it is a DevOps organization and they're continuous just by nature, right? But there's somebody who has left the team or somebody's joining the team, so that the forming stage, or maybe it's the very first time a group of people are getting together, or it is InfoSecurity kicking off an initiative or a project. There's all kinds of triggers really for this forming phase. But here we go, zooming in on the content of the characteristics and also the strategies that occur with forming. So here are the things that are typically seen. Things are new, and with that comes with typically people are excited and they're eager and they're socializing, and generally speaking, the tone is sort of polite, safe topics. But no matter how much is shared up front on this project or this endeavor, whatever your company calls it, the sprint or iteration or whatever it is, still, this is the very beginning, and it's perfectly normal, according to Dr. Tuckman and others, the literature, to have people feel uncertain or unclear about how the team is going to fulfill the objective, particularly if they've never done something like it before, right? So it's really a matter of degree, depending on the particulars of the situation. But how they're going to contribute and how they're going to personally contribute to the team's performance in fulfilling the objective. So because of that, it is perfectly normal, according to the literature, for some team members to have some anxiety and some questioning. But here's what can be done about that. Here, somebody, and that person could be a InfoSecurity manager, it could be a project manager, it could be a scrum master, whoever, right? It depends on the organization and how you run your project or your initiative or your work. But somebody's taken the lead. And by that, I mean they're very, very visible, right? And an example of what might occur is doing introductions, even on a team that has worked together before, can be helpful. It can be brief, according to the literature. It doesn't need to be long. The whole exercise maybe is 5 or 10 minutes, right? And it's a one-time endeavor for every time the team gets together. It's particularly helpful when you have team members working on the team who haven't worked together before. But even for people who have worked together before, it's still helpful. Some companies do icebreakers, some don't. Just giving you that as an idea for consideration. Sharing as much information as possible as early as possible. And by the way, some of these points here and on subsequent phases, you might reflect just seem like a good practice or good common sense. And if that's your view, I would agree entirely with you on that. The reason they're listed here is these are the ones that are particularly powerful and effective on helping the team get out of forming and into subsequent phases. And the same goes when you see strategies in subsequent phases. So please keep that in mind. Success criteria. So this may not apply, but I'll just give you an example. If it's true that this project must be done by November 1st, if that's true, some companies do operate that way. But just as an example, if that's true, well, you want to know about that now, right? Not a month from now or 2 months from now or 3 months from now. So you want to know sort of what the high level success criteria or the requirements are as early as possible. It's okay for the details to come out later, which is very typical, but any high level requirements or success criteria as early as possible. And because of our time, I'm going to move on. And that brings us to storming. And Dr. Tuckman says that regardless of the title, which kind of strikes a lot of people as negative, it's very normal and very typical. And with that, you have a visual that really matches that. People can have a level of storming or frustration, and it's often based on differences of opinions. Keep in mind the project is very early on, and Dr. Tuckman and other researchers, there's no time requirement for the respective phases. In some mature, highly functioning teams, particularly where it's the same people or mostly the same people working again and again together, they can get through storming so quickly that it's a blip and it almost, or it's almost not a blip, I should say. It almost seems like, from an outsider point of view, that there's really almost no storming at all. However, I've been alerted to the point from some prior presentations of earlier versions of this talk that sometimes, based on the description, which I'm about to delve into, that it's entirely possible for the team to be in storming for the almost the entire life of the project. And that's certainly not the goal, right? Nobody would consciously want to be in the storming phase, but the literature is clear about storming occurring typically after forming. And here's what happens. There can be resistance and a lack of participation based on differences of opinions. Regardless of job titles, there can be sort of jockeying for position in terms of contribution, and perhaps it's not conscious, but it's people trying to figure out how they're going to make the contribution within this this endeavor, this project, this sprint or iteration, whatever it's called. Compared with other phases, emotions are relatively high. This phase, in general, tends to be a sort of a higher amplitude and duration when you have a team working on something that they've never worked on before, and or team members that have never worked together before, or sort of a combination of those. That's sort of what the literature hints at in terms of what's typically seen. But the good news is, regardless of your particular situation, here's what you can do. So somebody, again, that person, a cybersecurity manager or lead, a project manager, a scrum master, whoever that person is, requesting and encouraging feedback. Here's what's meant by that specifically, though, because who wouldn't? I mean, that seems like a good idea for all projects and all phases. Here's what's meant by that. Whether it's in person or it's virtual, so the particulars will vary based on those sort of situations. Somebody is saying, you know, if you come across any questions or concerns, including small ones, please let me know, and then maybe give 2 or 3 ways that they can, with as lowest level of friction as possible, can surface a concern or a question. You know, email me or chat or hop on a Zoom call or pop in my office, or, you know, give several ways. And it's not a one-time invitation. It's a recurring invitation for feedback. The point here is, according to the literature and my own experience, is that, you know, often the larger issues and problems, impediments, whatever they're called, are sort of self-revealing and everybody knows about them rather quickly. Sometimes it's the smaller issues that, especially in aggregate, can be a bit of a drag in terms of the performance and happiness of the team. And so by requesting and encouraging feedback on a continuous basis and having the right tone, right, in terms of your invitation for feedback and responding with appreciation, you're able to identify these issues that otherwise wouldn't come out, or might possibly come out at the very end of the project when you do a review. So very, very important, and please keep that in mind according to the literature. And I want to jump to the last bullet point. Certainly there have been lots of great talks and books, aplenty, about trust. As it relates to this conversation, though, people are extremely complicated. Projects are extremely complex. Here's what can be done, however, according to the literature and my own experience. Let's say you have an agile team. You don't have to, but let's just say, for this example, you have an agile team, and let's say it's Scrum. And let's say that every workday from 9 to 9:15 local time, in person or virtually, the team is going to get together, and, you know, typically it's, you know, what did you do since the last meeting? What are you going to do in the new workday? And any issues or impediments. The format of it isn't important. Those are just what's typically asked in most organizations. And let's say you're going to do that every workday. Now listen, things happen. So maybe a meeting gets canceled. That's not what I'm about to address. But let's say 3 of them get canceled in a row, or 4 get canceled in a row, especially at the beginning of the project. Well, not only are you not honoring commitments, you're eroding trust. And so anyways, it's by honoring commitments, as simple as it might sound, goes a real long ways in terms of building trust. And that brings us to the norming phase. As you can see from the graph above, it's the second highest level of performance in terms of productivity and happiness for the team. Here, a very different visual, not a hierarchy, but rather showing the interconnectivity compared with forming and storming. And here, compared with earlier phases, the goals and the purpose of the project are much more well understood. And with that translates in most people a higher level of confidence and improved engagement. And the second to the last bullet point here talks about relief or lowered anxiety. So if there is anxiety during storming, which is perfectly normal, according to Dr. Tuckman and others, it is lowered or eliminated during the norming phase. And then that last bullet point really speaks more to the visual, and that would be the team is starting to develop cohesion in terms of how they interact with each other relative to the forming and storming phases earlier. And here's what you can do to get the team grow and advance, which in this case means move on to phase 4, performing, which is the highest level of performance. You do a time check here, and that would be this. Not waiting to the end of the project, but along the way, recognizing both individual and the collective team efforts and accomplishments. If it's something that can be done in your organization, learning opportunities along the way. Some organization, this may or may not make sense. It's typically done in agile organizations, but not exclusively, and that is a little degree of cross-training in terms of dev and QA, for example, being able to step into the other roles and make a contribution if necessary. So there can be a little bit of sort of cross-training or cross-learning for the team to the extent that it makes sense. That's what that second bullet point speaks to. Here, compared with earlier phases, the team is in the second highest level of performance. So that person, the Scrum Master, Project Manager, InfoSecurity lead, whoever that person is, sort of pulling back and only getting involved if and when necessary. So speaking to the energy, monitoring the energy of the team, very different from earlier on. And that brings us to the highest level of performance, which, by the way, correlates with happiness, and that is performing. And here, a very different visual showing really the interconnectivity. I think it's the last bullet point here. Yes, demonstrations of interdependence and self-management, sometimes called self-organization, in some circles, I should say. So here you have, compared with earlier phases, pretty high level of motivation, trust, and empathy, where if there's questions or concerns, the individuals on the team typically will defer to the larger team needs when questions come up. And certainly they're producing their deliverables, and the performance is very consistent. So this is what's happening during performing. And so just keep a mental picture of this compared with forming, storming, and norming, and you can see this is the highest level of performance. But this is an open, active phase. The project's not done yet. So this is really more about these strategies here, about keeping the momentum going on the team. Here, similar to remarks I made earlier, minimal intervention, getting involved only when necessary, celebrating successes. And here, this last bullet point is the main thing that separates the norming from the performing, and that is where the team is engaged in collective decision-making and problem solving, which is, again, reflected really by that diagram also, or the visual of the team at left. And here, the leader is encouraging the team to do so if they're not, and if they are, to continue doing so. So that's what can be done here. And then that brings us to adjourning. So a very different visual. It's really sort of maybe the flip side of forming is adjourning. And it is misunderstood. One of the top misunderstandings of adjourning is that the people never work, they go away and they never work together again. For example, in a agile scrum, just because you're at the end of the sprint doesn't mean that your team won't work together again. So it doesn't force people to stop working together. It just means that the combination of the people and the scope has been fulfilled. So adjourning, that's really what adjourning means. More on that here. So I do want to say up front that, well, not up front, this is almost the end, that Dr. Tuckman introduced 4 phases in 1965: forming, storming, norming, and performing. However, he and a colleague of his, Marianne Jensen, found that adjourning was so important that Dr. Tuckman, with the help of Marianne Jensen, updated his own model in 1977 to include adjourning. So if you were to Google, for example, some of the keywords that have been discussed here, maybe Dr. Tuckman or team development and similar phrases and terms, unfortunately, about half of the results will say there are 4 phases. It's not true. There are 5 because Dr. Tuckman updated his own model. So if anyone says there are 4, they're referring to the 1965 model, but in 1977 it was updated. So, geez, it's been 45 years. I think people would be on board, but maybe they need another 45 to understand that there are 5 phases, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. Also, it is called adjourning. And because so many people call it transitioning or mourning, I want to call that out, that it's often called that, but it's not. It's adjourning. The reason it's not transitioning or mourning, because it may or may not be transitioning or mourning. So why call it that? Here, I'll jump to the mourning example in the interest of time. Picture, it doesn't have to be this scenario, but picture it's a big team. And it's 100 people, including InfoSecurity, of course. And let's say it's a big InfoSecurity endeavor, actually. And it's 100 people, cross-functional, people from legal and marketing and web dev and everybody, right? And it was a year-long project, and it was a phenomenal success. All the goals were achieved of the project. And now it's time for people outside of InfoSecurity to return to their regularly assigned responsibilities, to go back to legal, to go back to marketing, and so on. Well, believe it or not, the literature is very clear on this. Some people can actually experience sort of a simultaneous conflicting emotions of satisfaction from the success of the work, the hard work and diligence of the project, at the same time sadness that it's all over. And because that's a possibility, it could be viewed as the mourning phase, but it isn't necessarily. So let's just call it adjourning, because that's what Dr. Tuckman called it. Here, I'm going to jump to, in the interest of time, the strategies to help the team grow. Really, this should be, because I'm keeping the font large, right? If I had more room, I would say strategies to help the individuals on the team and the company grow, because the project is done at this point, right? And that is, firstly, as it relates particularly to potential sadness or potential mourning, or just a good practice, recognizing change. It might be quite obvious that everything is over and people need to return to their regularly assigned responsibilities, if that's the case. But just to call it out, the project manager, the InfoSecurity lead, whoever's that person, an executive in the organization, relating that clearly can go a real long ways in terms of helping people understand that they made a big contribution on this project, and now it's time to go on to the next project or return to the department, or whatever the situation calls for in your organization for that unique project. Here is an opportunity for what some people call lessons learned, retrospectives, post-project reviews, postmortems. It doesn't really matter what the labels are. The questions that are often asked are, what went well, what didn't go well, what would we change? But you could ask any question you'd like. Those are the ones that are often asked. And the idea here is that when you ask these questions, you solicit the feedback. You are likely to hear things that would not come up on their own, particularly at the end of the project. And if the company is able to capture these lessons learned and implement them, into the organization, it has a competitive advantage the next time it does a project that's even partially similar to this project next time around. So there's a big benefit for everyone to do that. And here I want to jump to the last bullet point, celebrating the team's accomplishments. The literature is very clear on this. This has a big impact. The part that surprised me the most, and it may or may not surprise you, is the following. Certainly the individuals on the team and the team as a whole benefit from somebody, whoever's the right person in your organization. It's the CEO, it's the head of InfoSecurity, whoever this person is to, whether it's in person in a meeting, whether it's over an email, whether it's on a Zoom call, whatever the delivery mechanism is, to express appreciation for the hard work, diligence, and contribution of the team. It goes a real long ways. Here's the part, though, that surprised me, that's very clear in the literature, and you'll have to let me know later if this surprised you. And that's this. The benefit to doing that is having a party or an after party, right, is not just the individuals on the team and the team as a whole. It's also those people who had nothing to do with the project at all, but are in the company. And the reason for that, according to the research, is that it is reinforcing to everyone, including those who weren't even involved in the project, how the company really appreciates the hard work and diligence and value that the teams of this type bring to the organization. And so with that, I'm going to move on in the interest of time and say that, I gave examples of sort of typical questions that people asked at the retrospective or the post-project review at the end. And you can ask anything you'd like. And it might even be a good idea to experiment and try asking different questions. But I do want to share with you, too, through experimentation and testing, I have found to be extremely powerful. This is from me, not from the literature, for the last few years. Here's one question for the team to ask and answer. How can we, the team, make an even bigger positive impact on the company? It's a very different question than asking what went well, what didn't go well. And the answers might surprise you, big and small, in terms of sort of category of responses. And another one to consider is for the team to ask and answer, how can we, the team, achieve even greater ease of work? And you'll be surprised, likewise, of the kinds of answers that come back from asking this kind of a question. And so those are the highlights of the 5 phases of team development. I do want to say that one of the frequent questions I get, so I'll just kind of address it right now briefly, is that the direction is typically, or almost always, don't have an exact percent for you because it varies by organization, but we'll just say, well, it's a lot, is going from left to right. Forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. Here would be an example of where the direction might go in the opposite direction, depending on the situation. Let's say the team has been working for a month and they're clearly in the performing phase, and 2 people leave the team unexpectedly and 2 people join the team. The team, not that it's sort of a conscious thing, but in terms of how they're behaving, right, the characteristics, they're probably going to be back in the forming phase. This is the typical situation where the team is in one phase and then they're moving in the opposite direction. But the good news is, if they were already in the performing phase, it's even quicker to get back there than the first time around. And you have the proven strategies for moving through the phases. So that's there. And so with that, I want to move to a quick wrap up here and say that forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning are all, according to Dr. Tuckman and other researchers, necessary and inevitable for teams to grow and deliver results. In this presentation, introduced the 5 phases. And if you were already familiar with them, I'm hoping that maybe you still got some fresh ideas. And if this was new to you, I hope it's a good overview of the 5 phases of team development, where we cover the characteristics of each phase, and then most importantly, the strategies for navigating the team from start to finish through the different phases. And as promised, I realize you can't see the detail here, there's a bibliography that has 65 items. such as Microsoft, Google, and so on, the ones that you saw in the visual. And also the main, speaking of visuals, the main image that we navigated, I put together as a 2-page high-resolution PDF for you. So if you're interested, it's available at bit.l, this is lowercase, should say that, bit.ly/VBC-7. And if you want to scan it, there's the code. You do a time check here. Okay. And because this URL, this link, is also on 1 or 2 subsequent slides, I'm going to move forward onto the next slide here and say that based on prior experience, many questions relate directly or indirectly to the visual. So I'm going to see if this works for us, if it's possible to have one of the moderators from the conference, if there's any comments or questions, if they're able to verbalize them while I have the screen up, that would be ideal. And if not, I can go to plan B. But are there any comments or questions that we have that we can raise?
Yeah, we've got one here. So is it possible for different team members to be at different stages? For example, if you have a performing team but hire someone new who is trying to find their place on the team, does that mean that the whole team drops back to storming or norming?
Well, thank you for that and all questions. And I have to tell you, first time I've heard that question, but here's what the literature says and my own experience. What we're talking about here is the overall assessment of the team. For example, let's just say you are in the performing phase. Well, that doesn't mean that there aren't problems, bumps on the road, issues, risks materialize into issues, right? And the team can get through them. It's sort of like the pervasive overall phase. And so it is possible to have somebody on the team, have the team sort of overall be in the performing phase. But an example in the real world, in my experience and from the literature, that speaks to the question or the scenario, my understanding of the question and the scenario is, if somebody is joining the team while the team is already in flight, let's say the team isn't performing, this would be a typical example of the situation where maybe one person is exhibiting storming. Well, what you can do is you can help that person, you can really focus attention on them and help sort of onboard them, for lack of a better term, onto the project as quickly as possible and help navigate them into the performing phase. So the more people exhibiting the behavior, the better, but it is speaking to the overarching assessment of the team's performance. And obviously people are unique and different, so some people will exhibit it to a more or lesser degree, but it's overall, how is the team behaving? Any other questions or comments?
Some people say that there are 4 phases of team development. Others say there are 5. Is it 4 or 5?
Thank you. This is a peeve of mine, and I shouldn't say it's a peeve of mine, but it is. There are 5. It's forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And the reason is Dr. Tuckman, with his colleague, updated his own model in 1977 to add adjourning. And if people think there are 4, I don't blame them, because there's so much content out there that says that. But I take my responsibility seriously. And by the way, in the bibliography, I've got the information that speaks to Dr. Tuckman's studies and many of the other studies. So if you're curious for more information later, this is why I put it together in a bibliography for you. Any other questions or comments?
We've got one more here. Are there any proven, usable strategies which can be leveraged to advance the team's productivity, happiness, and success?
Yeah, well, that's kind of a really sort of the abstract for this talk, really. And that was really the goal, what I wanted to do, among other things, to make this talk unique, because the model, Dr. Tuckman's research, is not unique in the sense that it was published in 1965, and there have been tons of talks at all kinds of venues about his model. But I take what Dr. Tuckman said very seriously, in that, for example, there are 5 phases and not 4. And I sifted through all of the studies, the scientific papers and the like, to extract just that from that question, the provable, usable strategies in plain language as much as possible that we can use, rather than just say it's a great model. And that's nice to know that people think that. or that it sort of validates that. But it's more important to understand exactly how you can use the model for your benefit and the benefit of the team. And with that, because I'm keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to move to this slide here and say that, post-project reviews or retrospectives aren't just for projects, they're also for talks. And one way that I improve this talk is to understand if it's working for you, if it's resonating with you. And along those lines, I wanted to have something that's very seamless and easy. So I have a Google form, and it asks your name, your email is optional, and what did you think? And that's it. And so it's at lowercase bit.ly/YES-7. And there's the code that you can scan if you'd like. And if you are able to fill in this survey, I want to thank you in advance for doing so. I really appreciate your feedback. It really helps tremendously. And when you hit the submit button on the Google form, I have a very short thank you message with lots of links to my LinkedIn and my Facebook and my Twitter and my website and so on. So sometimes people have questions after talks, after conferences. Actually, it's quite normal. And so I welcome them. So your question, your feedback is not limited to this live presentation. If you have a question or a comment later, that's one of many ways which you can reach out to me. Also, if you do download the 2-page high-resolution PDF, in the footer of it, there's the link to my website and my Twitter and so on. So that's another way you can reach out to me afterwards if you'd like to do so. And with that, I hope that you're able to leverage these proven strategies to help the teams and, frankly, your own happiness, productivity, and success. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Scott. And that wraps up, I guess, Monday at B-Sides. So thanks, everyone, for attending. We're going to be killing the broadcast in a few seconds here, and we'll see you all back again tomorrow.